Star rankings don't matter. How many times have you heard that? Recruiting rankings are overrated. How many times have we heard that? Now, sometimes you will get anecdotal evidence or an example of a kid who was rated 5 stars and he goes bust for many different reasons. And then you got someone who waves their flag around and says, told you those recruiting rankings don't matter. Well, what the recruiting rankings are not is an inexact science, but what they are is deadly accurate, more so than they have been in the history of this industry. But you don't have to take my word for it. I wouldn't take my word for it. I would force me to back it up. So here walks someone into the room. I dare you to back that up, Josh. Thank you, someone. We just had the NFL draft. And you know, at 24/7 Sports, there are 32 5-stars in every class, and that is pretty much modeled by predicting 4 years down the road, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, who you think the top 32 in the NFL draft would be. Of course, it's impossible to nail that, but that is the working theory behind who you make a 5-star. You want to know how the industry did this year, kids? Because this is not the time of year where you ever hear people talking about recruiting rankings, is it? No, no, no. This is not the time of year where anyone's ever shouting from the mountaintops, oh, stars don't matter. Oh, you can get to the NFL no matter what you're rated. That's technically true, but that's not in a vacuum. What we want to know is how accurate is the recruiting industry? In other words, if they give you 5 stars, how much more likely are you to maybe be a high round draft pick or be drafted, period, than if you're a 4-star or a 3-star or a 2-star or unranked? Well, we have numbers. We don't have to worry about it. We have numbers. So 13 5-stars, 13 former 24/7 Sports 5-stars just win in the first round. I mention that because that is the most ever. 24/7 Sports has never had a better NFL draft as it relates to formerly ranked 5-star players than they just had. Now, I'm not on the Recruiting Rankings Council. I'm not on the committee. I just kind of sit over here and watch. And so, golf clap for you guys. Barton Simmons is probably over watching the show in a darkened office at Vanderbilt. He was part of that. Charles Power was a big part of that. He's over at On 3 now. So a lot of folks who are here were a part of it. A lot of folks who aren't here anymore or are not here anymore were a part of that. But I'm not strictly even speaking about 24/7. I want to zoom it out for a second. Just look at the industry. I am very, very partial and very biased towards our guys here because I get to see how the sausage is made, and I know they do a great job. And I also know the actual process, which I won't bore you with tonight, but it is very laborious, and you guys know how rarely I use that term. But here is what I wanted you to focus on. So my contention is the recruiting industry. Star rankings have never been more accurate. So actually, the guys at On3 put up a stat earlier today, and these are shocking numbers. Let's just look industry-wide. If you were a 5-star player in this last draft, you stood an 81.3% chance of being drafted, as it turns out. If you were a former 4-star player, you stood a 22.6% chance of being drafted. So let's just hit the pause button right there. Oh, 5-star, 4-star, it doesn't matter. Oh, that's all just subjective. They're not really judging it on criteria about critical traits. They're just playing favorites with various programs. No, it turns out they're right. It turns out there is a little more science behind that than a lot of folks will lead you to believe. Again, former 5-star player, 81.3% chance of being drafted. Former 4-star player, 22.6% chance of being drafted. Also, if you're a former 5-star player, as of this last draft, you were 21 times more likely to be drafted than a 2-star or lower. 21 times. I want to read that aloud one more time. Former 5-star rated players, 21 times more likely to be drafted than a former 2-star or an unranked player. So anytime someone walks up to you and says, recruiting rankings don't matter, don't take them seriously as a person, at least as a college football fan. Now, if they tell you they're not the end-all, be-all, if they tell you it's not a death sentence if someone puts 2 stars on you, that's accurate. You ultimately have a lot to say about that. But to think that there's not sort of solid work that's gone into formulating that star ranking. No, the NFL draft just craps on that every single year and continues to do it more and more. There's another thing that I want to talk to you about, and that is something that I just hinted around, and that is inherent bias in the rankings process due to things like which program you commit to. The Bama bump has always been a really, really popular term in the recruiting industry. And again, I bring it up in April because no one else talks about the Bama bump in April. Everyone talks about the Bama bump around signing day. Everyone talks about the Bama bump in December because they get really mad because Nick Saban signs a lot of highly rated players, and there's this allegation that they're highly rated because Nick Saban's signing them, and the recruiting industry always wants to scratch Alabama's back. Will Anderson, class of 2020. I will never forget it because we talked about it on the show as it was happening. He kept vaulting every single rankings update. He kept jumping several dozen spots, and eventually Will Anderson, Alabama commitment, lands inside the top 10 players in the country. Guess what was said about Will Anderson? Bama bump. Guess what was said about Will Anderson? Well, that's just Bama bias. Yeah, he's a good player, but come on, top 10. You know what I didn't hear the other day? I didn't hear a single person talking about the Will Anderson Bama bump as Will Anderson went off the board at number 3 overall, as Will Anderson became the number 1 defensive player overall taken 3 years later. I didn't hear a word. These people turned into ghosts. I could even zoom it out and look at the entire SEC, because as much as we hear about Bama bias and the Bama bump, I hear it about the SEC all the time. Whenever we talk about the conference on the show, whenever you see them covered nationally, there's always the allegation of SEC bias. And really all that means is the allegation is people are making a bigger deal of the SEC than the SEC naturally deserves to have made about it. And I've always laughed at it because I've always asked people, if you believe that, you believe the NFL's in on it too. And they say, what are you talking about? No, this has nothing to do with the NFL. Oh, it does. It does, because for the 17th year in a row, the SEC just led all of America in terms of overall draft picks by conference. Wasn't too far ahead of the Big Ten this year. I'm going to talk about the Big Ten in a second. So you guys up in Chicago and Indianapolis, hang tight. Hey, it's a really good point you want me to make, and I'm going to make it for you. Hang tight. But the old SEC bias crowd, they're ghosts this time of year too. That's why I choose to do this segment every Sunday after the draft, because I want to remind you, when you think about banging this drum later in the fall, please remember you're going to have to account for those words, at least on this show, come April. 17th straight season now. The SEC just had the most draft picks of any conference. 8 of the top 16, first round, 8 of the top 16 from the SEC. Here's a little paper-popping stat producer Jesse brought my way today. Since 2017, SEC has 79 first-rounders. That's 35 more than any other conference. And I said, Jesse, that's good. Give me something great. And so he went to digging. You know what he found? And this is a Post-it pop, because this wouldn't even fit on the sheet of paper. I don't need the whole SEC. Just give me Georgia, Bama, LSU, and Florida. They had more draft picks than the entire Big 12. They had more draft picks than the entire Pac-12. And Georgia, Bama, LSU, and Florida had as many draft picks as the ACC. I've got a little mini conference, even within that power conference of the SEC, where just 4 of them, just a little small box of the teams in the SEC, they're outdoing several Power 5 conferences. It gets even worse, depending on your perspective. I would call this worse if I were just a non-SEC college football fan. Remove Georgia from the SEC. Take Bama out. Get rid of LSU. Get rid of Florida. Just take what's left. That remainder of the SEC still had more draft picks than the Pac-12 and had as many draft picks as the Big 12, which would make a newcomer to the college football party ask, well, why do you guys call it Power 5? It sounds to me like there's the SEC, and then there's the Big 10. I'm about to talk about them. And then there's, well, who else? Everyone else, right? Not a bad point, newcomer. Power 5 is something that we've just said for a long time, but more and more and more, as you extrapolate the data, you've got a Power 2 in college football, and the Big 10 had the same number of first-round draft picks this past draft as the SEC did. They had 20 in rounds 1 and 2, and that is a record. That is the most ever first and second round combined draft picks for the Big 10. SEC, Big 10, then you got a cliff, and then you got the rest of the country. That does not mean, please don't misunderstand me, that does not mean on any given Saturday you couldn't have Texas go beat Michigan. They'll play next year. That's why I mentioned those 2 teams. That doesn't mean you couldn't have Texas come into Tuscaloosa and beat Alabama this year. Doesn't mean that. What it does mean in totality is something I'm going to talk about a lot later in the show, especially when it comes to how we view this conference-built structure we call college football, and especially when we format a postseason for this sport we call college football. Yeah. Last note I wanted to give you here, just to illustrate the gap between the SEC, Big Ten, and the rest of the country. Total draft picks. Always love looking at this stat after we get through a draft. SEC led the way. They had 62 combined draft picks. The Big Ten was not far behind, 55. So SEC 62, Big Ten 55. How close do you think the next closest conference was? That would be the ACC, and that would be 32. Then the Big 12 at 30. Then the Pac-12 at 27. So if you want to insert, and it's not even close, this right here, this conversation would be where you insert, and it's not even close. But yeah, people who tell you star rankings don't matter, NFL Draft disproves you every time. People who tell you there's an inherent bias in the ranking system, the NFL Draft always serves to disprove that. Not just anecdotally. I used Will Anderson. I could have used 100 other examples. Far more times than not, the NFL Draft validates the recruiting industry rather than the other way around. So, while everyone else hates on them, I'm going to full-throated clap. Not even a golf clap. Full-throated clap. Way to go, guys.